brokered by Qatar, and we look forward to seeing all hostages released and humanitarian aid allowed to Gaza.
And that, unfortunately, brings to an end question period for the day. I do see rising on a point of order the member from, from Dufferin Caledon.
Speaker, in my question today, I asked the minister whether there were going to be 1,600 workers from Korea. On his way into the House of Commons, he was asked that question, and he said, "I'm not surprised there'd be a transfer of knowledge, as no one has done batteries in North America before." So he's admitting there will be those workers, and then accusing me of misinformation. He should withdraw.
Colleagues, I'd like to thank the member from Dufferin Caledon for raising this point. It has skated, I think, over into the point of debate. I do encourage the member, of course, to pose questions on this at the appropriate time.
As it is 3:20, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at the second reading stage of Bill C-57. Call on the members.
I invite all members to find their seats. The question is as follows. Ms. Ng, seconded by Ms. Ian, moved that Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on International Trade. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Sedgman.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. Duclos.
Monsieur Duclos.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Monsieur Champagne.
Monsieur Champagne.
Miss Tassi.
Miss Tassi.
Miss Suds.
Miss Suds.
Miss Bennett.
Miss Bennett.
Miss Murray.
Miss Murray.
Miss Grove.
Miss Grove.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Miss Qualtrough.
Miss Qualtrough.
Miss Haidu.
Miss Haidu.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Miss Ian.
Miss Ian.
Madame Bibeau.
Madame Bibeau.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Miss Jazik.
Miss Jazik.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Miss Jones.
Miss Jones.
Miss O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrettson.
Mr. Lamour.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Mr. Fragascato.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverdin.
Mr. Vancouverdin.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Chen.
Mr. Chen.
Miss Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Miss Dama.
Ms. Damoff.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Miss Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Mr. Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yacono.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Miss Hefner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Sidhu Brampton South.
Miss Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zayed.
Madame Lampopoulos.
Madame Lambropoulos.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Miss Latanzi.
Miss Latanzio.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Louis Kitchener Conestoga.
Mr. Van Dynen.
Mr. Van Dynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Cotto.
Mr. Koto.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diaz.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gayer.
Mr. Henley.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Miss Taylor Roy.
Miss Taylor Roy.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Miss Gaines.
Miss Gamey.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Idlout.
Miss Idlout. Go with the block.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur Fortin.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Monsieur Savard Tremblay.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Miss Blaney.
Miss Blaney.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Miss Gazan.
Miss Gazan.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Miss Barron.
Miss Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Miss Zarillo.
Miss Zarillo.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Descharlet.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Miss May Sandishgulf Islands.
Miss May Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Shear.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr.
Mr. Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Miss Finley.
Miss Findley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abulpay.
Mr. Abutaev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Siba.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Madame Yang.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Kramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Kramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Geneveux.
Monsieur Geneveux.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Mr. Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Currick.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Dreeshin.
Mr. Dreeshin.
Mr. Crown.
Mr. Crown.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Ellison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Back to Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
La Chambre attendra.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings. I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau va maintenant.
The table will now compile the results. Excuse me. I see the member for Kitchener South Hespeler.
Able to vote on the app?
Alors, Howard is a member from. Shoot. Le bureau. Hop, l'honorable député.
The honourable member.
My vote be registered as no.
Ms. Lewis, Haldeman Norfolk, nay, compte.
The honourable member from Calgary Confederation.
That's right. Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to ensure that I voted no and that it was recorded. Thank you.
Le bureau va.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 205, 205. Nays compte, 109, 109.
Je déclare la.
I declare the motion carried.
Second reading of this bill, deuxième lecture de ce projet de loi.
Committee on International Trade. Shall we?
Orders of the day. Orders of the day, ordre du jour, ordre émanant du gouvernement, projet de loi.
Government Bills Commons. Resuming second reading debate of Bill C-52. Enhancing Transparency and Accountability in the Transportation System Act.
I believe we go to the honourable member for. I'll just wait for a few people to clear. The honourable member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be splitting my time